Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Stack, along with Doug Stein. We started World Vasectomy Day, I think 11 years ago. I was on a trip to one of the crazy trips I took with Doug originally, and here we are years later. It's great to see everybody here. Um, Wanted to say, like, every 3 months we choose a topic, different topics, usually technical. This time we decided to take on a kind of one of those ethical challenges you guys face. I really admire that. I know this is not easy. There's a lot of differences of opinion. We've heard the opinions. We've reached out to people. We have some speakers to help us navigate it. I know Escar and I were on the phone yesterday with somebody from the ACLU. So we really, ready to have the talk. It's just an hour conversation. So it's not like we're going to cover all of the topics. That's not possible. Before we start, I wanted to just acknowledge a lot of work goes into doing these things. So I wanted to give special acknowledgement to Katy Cordova, who's here, who's helps coordinate this. This was not easy to do to get all this organized, but thank you, Katy, for this and the team and the translating. And for those who are interested, who need interpretation, at the bottom of your screen, there's an interpretation button. If at any point you want to do closed captioning, there's a captioning button at the bottom. So, any ways we can help you, we are, they're there, and you reach out if you have any problems. We'll try our best to help you. I wanted to say that we've also been working with a team in Africa, based in Uganda, and I wanted to acknowledge Kizza Blair, Dr. Kizza Blair. Now he got his doctorate, and Kizza put together classrooms. There are 7 classrooms in 7 different medical schools all throughout in 5 different African countries who are also participating. I don't know, Kizza, do you want to introduce really quickly the classes? He's there.
Yes, my absolute honor. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Greetings. I think this is, I don't know, I've been here a lot of times, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself again. I'm called Dr. Blair Kizza. I work with World Vasectomy Day, and I work as one of the program managers in Africa. I'm very happy. I'm very excited to be here today. And I've been in charge of trying to put different classrooms of medical students and even young professionals in very many parts of Africa. So today, joining us on this webinar, we have students and young doctors from Uganda. We have students and young doctors from Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, Rwanda, and they are joining in as we speak. There was a problem with in terms of the communication. The flyer was indicating 6 p.m. Yet it's 5 p.m. in East African time. But they're joining in, and I think they'll turn on their videos as the session goes along. Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. So, Doug, I pass on the microphone to you. I know you wanted to say a few things as well to introduce everybody.
Well, I may not be introducing everybody, Jonathan, but I would certainly like to extend my thanks to those people who contributed after the last webinar. I'd like to share my screen here, if that's possible, and go to that slide. And I'd like to sort of dedicate the Gold Medal Award for the most generous donor within 2 weeks of the last webinar to Melanie Savard-Cote, who donated at the $1,000 or more level. Our silver medal winner is Kevin Christie, who donated at the $500 or more level. Bronze goes to Lillian Caberos, who donated at the $100 or more level. And then honorable mentions to Catherine Cordova and Karina Martinez, who donated something at a lower level. But I just want to emphasize that World Vasectomy Day is a nonprofit organization. That means that we cannot charge for things like this. We only depend on donations. And while Jonathan is one of the most charismatic people that I've ever met, who convinces other people to work for free, that doesn't mean that there are no expenses. There's the expense of making websites, of hosting websites, of phone calls, paperwork. It just is a big budget. So whatever you can give is worthwhile. The other thing about a nonprofit organization is that its donor base is important, because the American taxing authorities look at the size of our base. So if you think that a donation of $2 is wrong, you're wrong. I'm sorry, is not worthwhile, you're wrong. It is just as much appreciated as a larger donation. So please, even a small donation really helps out in terms of extending World Vasectomy Day's donor base. So, you know, whatever you give your barber as a tip, or whatever you tip in a restaurant, whatever it is, just a few bucks is really, really helpful to us. And now it's really easy. You just go to worldvasectomyday.org and click the donate button right there. And you can leave your credit card, as you don't have to need a PayPal account or anything. Just leave your credit card, and we will greatly appreciate your donation. So once again, huge thanks to Melanie, Kevin, Lillian, Catherine, and Karina for their generous donations within 2 weeks of the last webinar. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Doug, for that. I guess I don't have to say that. I usually like to jump in and talk about that, but it doesn't get any better than that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Edgar Guarin. I am a volunteer member of World Vasectomy Day, and I'm going to be your moderator and presenter at the same time today. Before we start, Jonathan, is there anything else you would like to address before we get started? We have a packed schedule. We have a lot of information to provide, and I want to get going.
You go ahead. Go ahead, keep going.
All right, wonderful. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. So give me 1 second. And there you go. Can you see it now? Are you seeing my presentation there? Very good. All right. Welcome once again to the third webinar of World Vasectomy Day. We're excited that you all are here attending virtually, and to have the participation of our guest panelists and case presenters is great for us as well. We really hope this webinar leaves you hungry for more and interested in the topic we're discussing today. Para nuestra audiencia hispanoparlante, quiero darles la bienvenida a nuestro seminario virtual de World Vasectomy Day. Yo soy Edgar Guarin, un voluntario, miembro de World Vasectomy Day y vasectomista de tiempo completo. Estamos muy felices de tenerlos acá y esperamos que este seminario los deje con ganas de saber más, con ganas de discutir más y saber al respecto. I just did that presentation in Spanish, so those of you who are going to be using the translation, the simultaneous translation service, go to the bottom of the screen. There is a tiny little circle that says interpretation, and you can select the language there, so you can take advantage of this. And for those of you who need some captions, please take advantage of that also at the bottom of your screen. There's a lot to cover today, so let's get started. First of all, let me tell you about any conflict of interest. We have no conflicts associated with this particular event. However, in the interest of transparency and clarity, I believe it is important that we remind you of our mission as an organization. I'm going to stop for a second. I'm going to ask everyone, if you guys please can do it, to turn off your microphones, because we're having sound from somebody, and we're hearing a desk and some motion, and that's a little distracting. Thank you. So, as I said, it is important that we remind you of the mission that we have as an organization. And World Vasectomy Day, at World Vasectomy Day, we aim to increase awareness of sexual health and contraceptive opinions, and we believe in the importance of encouraging men to share reproductive responsibilities and become active participants in the conversation. Promoting vasectomies should happen within a frame of respect for the individual, without coercion or imposition. A vasectomy should be a personal expression of a definitive satisfaction of the individual with his fertility. That is, when he considers he has had the number of children he has desired, whatever that number might be. For us, respect for the decision of the individual is our greatest concern. I wanted to make that clear for what we do. The time for this webinar is, with no question, extremely insufficient for what we should be covering when having a conversation about permanent contraception in individuals with intellectual disabilities. We tried, however, to set up some general objectives, as you can see there, to give you a framework of our discussion. Initially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a historical perspective of vasectomies to see what happened with vasectomies and where we stand in terms of the procedure itself. We'll talk about generally individuals with disabilities and some aspects of sexual and reproductive health. And I'll touch upon a forced sterilization. This would set up the context for us to move on to our presenters, and I'll introduce them at a later point. So putting this together was not an easy task, and I must recognize that I personally might have miscalculated the size and the implications of this conversation. Discussing healthcare for individuals with intellectual disabilities is already a vast and very delicate debate. It is even more so when we focus on the provision of reproductive services. So let me set some expectations before we continue. What are we not going to do here today? We're not going to solve all the questions about the subject matter here, because this is a very dense and complex ethical issue. We're not going to provide a one-fits-all ethical template for you to apply. And certainly, we're not here to generate any judgment or criticism about the decisions made related to the cases presented here. But what we're going to do is we're going to try to provide context. We're going to try to provide general guidance on how to approach individuals with developmental disabilities. And hopefully, we will get to stimulate further review and discussion. Let's get on and start with a brief overview of the history of vasectomies. The first descriptions of male reproductive anatomy were made in the pre-Christian era by the Greek anatomist Herophilus. He described some of the structures, most of the structures of the reproductive male system. After a millennium, Mondino de Luzzi in Italy made additional descriptions. Later, in the 1600s, Regnier de Graaf carried out the first experimental works in which he demonstrated the distension of the vas deferens in the duct before intercourse. But it wasn't until the 19th century that Sir Astley Cooper demonstrated that the ligation of the vas deferens or the duct did not cause any damage to the testicle, unlike the ligation of the testicular artery and the vein. Later, Moore, Quake, and Oslund demonstrated in other species that vasectomy did not cause any damage to the testicle. The French urologist Félix Gaillon suggested for clinical practice the vasectomy as an alternative to castration, which actually had been practiced since the late 19th century as part of the treatment of prostatic hypertrophy. The initial purpose of the vasectomy by Dr. Gaillon was the induction of prostatic atrophy. Subsequently, the vasectomy as a procedure was recommended for the prevention of postoperative epididymitis after prostatectomy and was suggested to be done at the same time. There's an interesting period in the history of vasectomies, and it is related to this surgeon, the picture that you see there, Dr. Eugen Steineck, an Austrian surgeon who claimed that he could rejuvenate people by doing vasectomies. And this was based on his research of testicular physiology and some findings that he claimed he had with rats. The point was that this was an extremely popular proposal, and he became extremely famous to the point of being nominated twice for the Nobel Prize for his work. Even Sigmund Freud underwent the famous Steineck operation to try to counteract the recurrence of his jaw cancer and improve his sexuality. And as we know, it didn't work. And the lack of reproducibility of the observations of Dr. Steineck in control studies with the isolation of testosterone caused that the procedure decline in popularity. However, the procedure continued well into the mid-20th century. One of the most controversial moments of vasectomy in clinical practice has perhaps been the use for eugenic purposes. Eugenics was this movement established on a set of beliefs and practices aiming at improving the genetic quality of the human population. Francis Galton, this individual in the picture, used for the first time the word eugenics to describe the biological improvement of genes in human races and the concept of quote unquote well-born. He believed that differences in a person's ability were acquired primarily through genetics and that eugenics could be implemented through selective breeding. At the end, eugenics was more about preserving the position of dominant groups in the population through the promotion of discriminatory practices like forced sterilization, marriage restrictions, and selective breeding. As you can imagine, people who became targets of eugenics movement were those who were seen as quote unquote unfit for society. That included the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, and specific communities of color. At the end of the 19th century, vasectomy, unfortunately, was suggested as a, quote, ideal method to eradicate hereditary diseases among the human race. One of the most eminent surgeons in the United States, Albert Oxner, suggested the sterilization of, quote, recurrent criminals, drunks, imbeciles, perverts, and the poor, to, unquote, to protect the community, quote, unquote, without hurting the criminals. This was suggested instead of castration already, that had already been indicated in some criminal cases at the beginning of the 20th century. The first dedicated eugenic vasectomist was Dr. Harry Sharp. He was the medical director of the prison health service in the state of Indiana in the United States. He performed the first procedure after he was suggested to an inmate who requested castration due to excessive masturbation. They said that apparently it created some difference in the behavior of this individual. The point is that by 1907, with these practices, the governor of Indiana signed the very first involuntary sterilization law in the United States. And Dr. Sharp became the national authority on eugenic sterilization. By the end of the 1930s, 32 states in the United States already had regulations for the practice of involuntary sterilization for criminals and institutionalized people. Similar rules were implemented in other countries, and certainly Nazi Germany took the template from the United States and applied it in its own soil. Countries like Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, and Finland also had similar laws. Happily, by the end of the 1960s, the practice was discontinued in the interest of defending the fundamental rights of individuals. As the eugenic practice of vasectomy decreased, the first efforts to implement it with the general population appear with difficulty. But as you can imagine, there was, due to the eugenic background, there was some fear and doubt on part of the surgeons regarding the legality of the practice. There was this fear of litigation to the detriment of professionals due to malpractice in that limited access to those who voluntarily wish to be sterilized. That's the reason why some organizations began to establish parameters and guidelines for carrying out sterilization procedures, as you can see there, like the British Family Planning Association or the American College of OBGYNs. In the late 1950s, the nonprofit organization Marie Stopes International, which has now changed its name, started advertising vasectomy as a contraceptive method, and even had truist packages for French citizens for whom vasectomies was illegal. And probably many of you might not know, but until 1999, vasectomies were illegal, considered to be illegal in France, due to a very old, antiquated Napoleonic law that condemned any mutilation procedure. And that's why it was not done then. That's a good overview, brief, really quick, and I know it's really packed about the history of vasectomies. It's important to know where we were, how vasectomies were used, and the association with individuals of vulnerable segments of society. Let's switch gears and talk about developmental disabilities. Developmental disabilities are limitations in the intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior of individuals that manifest during the developmental period from birth to early adulthood, that is before age 18. These limitations include conceptual, social, and practical skills, and they're likely to continue indefinitely. False or uninformed assumptions about individuals with disabilities and their limitations might lead the public and even healthcare professionals to not differentiate between disability and disease, which are not the same. Disability experts make a distinction between a medical model and a social neurodiverse model to approach individuals with disabilities. In the medical model, more commonly encountered, disability is viewed as a deficiency or disease that needs to be overcome, whereas in the social neurodiverse model, is viewed as a natural part of the human experience. The focus there is on maximizing the potential as opposed to normalization, encouraging individuals with disabilities to pursue their strengths while mitigating their weaknesses. For example, in a medical model, an individual with mobility impairment might receive intensive physical therapy, braces, or even surgery to help them walk. That is not wrong, but that shouldn't be the only focus. In the social model, in the social neurodiverse model, instead, interventions might include the use of a motorized wheelchair, ramps, and adaptive physical education. The point is that with appropriate medical care, accommodations, and decision-making support, persons with developmental disabilities can live quality lives in their own homes and communities. Every jurisdiction has some specific level of protection for developmental disabilities. One of our presenters will share some information about that later in our webinar. In the United States, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990 prohibits discrimination based on disability. Worldwide, in May of 2008, with over 165 signing countries, the United Nations issued the first legally binding international treaty specifically for persons with disabilities. The primary purpose of the treaty is to promote, protect, and ensure that full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their dignity. You can go and look at the list of signatory countries and the United Nations website, but I can tell you that the United States, although the United States signed it initially in May of 2008, has failed to ratify the treaty. Although the goal in healthcare for individuals with developmental disabilities is to improve their well-being and function for their participation in family and community, there are significant health disparities in access, education, and preventive care, among other areas. Those disparities, specifically related to reproductive health care, are associated with some of these barriers that you see there. In terms of healthcare, there's insufficient education in caring for individuals with disabilities. The education of medical professionals seems to be insufficient, and there are perhaps internal personal biases and the uncertainty in the care of individuals with disabilities that become a barrier for the access of these individuals to proper health care. Sexual education also has barriers. It is known that there is insufficient formal or even informal opportunities for appropriate sexual education for individuals with developmental disabilities. You know, they're more likely not to have sex education than individuals without disabilities. And this is perhaps associated with certain misconceptions about reproduction and sexual health that individuals without the disabilities have related to these individuals. Contraception is a very controversial topic, and we know, and this is something that one of our presenters is going to share with us, that gynecological needs are less likely to be met in general on patients with developmental disabilities. The existing data, which is not necessarily extensive in some of these topics, is related mostly to sexual and reproductive care of females. Research on vasectomies and individuals with developmental disabilities is relatively limited. However, these barriers that you see there are applicable as well for both men and women with disabilities. Finally, with pregnancy and parenting, first, there's not proper tracking in many areas. We don't know. For example, in the Netherlands, it is estimated that 1.5% of individuals with developmental disabilities have become parents, and there's a similar number in Germany. But there are many other countries where there's no tracking of that. It is known that those individuals who become parents are more likely to suffer discrimination, and they don't receive the support they need. And remember that support plays an important role in parental success, regardless of whether or not you have a disability. People without a disability with adequate support are more successful at parenting, and so are patients with intellectual disabilities. Finally, just to finish this really packed context that I wanted to give you, let's talk about forced sterilization. And let's start with a definition of forced sterilization. This is the involuntary or coerced removal of a person's ability to reproduce, often through a surgical procedure. Basically, it happens when an individual does not agree to the intervention. This could be because either no one tells the patient, or when the individual doesn't have the chance to say if they want to, which can happen with a judicial determination, without even the presence of the patient, or when someone else makes the decision. According to United Nations, without full, free, and informed consent, forced sterilization is not only discriminatory, but is also in violation of human rights. In the United States, we've had numerous examples of this practice, starting with the state of Indiana, where in 1907, the very first compulsory sterilization law in the world was issued. Those are examples of the things that have happened. We ended up with compulsory laws in 33 states of the United States, and it is estimated that over 65,000 individuals, and this seems to be an underestimation of the true number, were sterilized in those 33 states. As another example, between the 1930s and 1970s, nearly 1/3 of the female population in Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, was sterilized. And in North Carolina, during the same period of time, it is estimated that 7,600 women were sterilized forcefully, and 5,000 of those were African American. According to a report by the US-based nonprofit National Women's Law Center, despite the dismantling of the old eugenics compulsory laws that existed in the United States, there are 31 states where the law supports, through a judicial order, the performance of sterilization procedures upon the request of guardians for individuals with disabilities, and in some cases, minors. This is a map that shows you in purple all those cases where forced sterilization and defined as we said a minute ago, is allowed. And there are only a couple of states where it is banned completely. I know I went through a lot of information, but this was necessary to have a context for our webinar and to set the tone for our presenters. This slide just shows you examples of forced sterilization around the world. As you know, in Nazi Germany, during the 1930s, and Peru recently in the 1990s, campaigns of sterilization were targeted to women, indigenous women, under the government of Alberto Fujimori. In Uzbekistan in the 2000s, there was evidence of coercion of women to undergo sterilization. And in India, which is very well known, in two periods, in the 1970s and the 2010s, there was improper incentivization or coercion of individuals to undergo sterilization procedure. These are examples, and there are many more examples around the world about this. I hope this was enough to set the tone, to get a context of what we're discussing today. I want to move on to our main presenters. Let me remind you that we will have the presentations, then it will be followed by two cases related to individuals with developmental disabilities. So please write down your questions, as we will have an open discussion at the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this moment. And I'm very happy to introduce our first presenter. And we're going to present, I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Kinda Abushbara. She is a doctor in education. She has a PhD in education with an emphasis on disability studies from Chapman University. She holds a master's degree from Arizona State University in social justice and human rights. She is the author of the book Life on Wheels, published in 2008, where she describes her own experience as a student with disabilities at a higher education institute. Her master's applied project titled The Reproductive Healthcare Experiences of Women with Physical Disabilities examine how women with physical disabilities with access to primary health insurance have been treated in relation to their sexuality and reproductive freedoms. She will be sharing her experience navigating the healthcare system for the fulfillment of her reproductive healthcare needs as a person with disabilities herself. Dr. Abushbara, thank you so much for being with us, and the forum is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm just going to share a little bit about my own reproductive health care experiences as a person with a disability. I was born in Jordan in 1985, and due to an obstructive labor, I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at 11 months of age in the U.S. My parents decided to immigrate to the U.S. when I was 3 years old for better health care and educational experiences. I have a bachelor's in sociology from ASU, a master's in social justice and human rights from ASU, and a PhD in education with an emphasis on disability studies from Chapman University. I currently teach disability studies at ASU. My master's thesis examined the reproductive health care experiences of physically disabled women. I interviewed 10 women and wrote about the history of forced sterilization of disabled people using feminist theory and the social model of disability. I found that younger participants were more able to be assertive with their healthcare providers and had better experiences. Older women had a more difficult time accessing reproductive health care. However, the sample size was too small to generalize from. So a little bit about me. I started my periods at age 13, and from the beginning, they were extremely painful and irregular. As a teenager, I tried oral contraceptives, which exacerbated my movement disorder. I tried a depot shot, which led to weight gain. For 10 years as an adult, I did not pursue treatment while tolerating an extremely disabling pain. At the age of 30, I had an IUD inserted under general anesthesia at Mayo Clinic. This led to a worsening of pain and cramps. I had it removed and tried oral contraceptive again. The pain was back, so I scheduled an MRI. The MRI was for diagnosis of endometriosis in an abnormally small uterus. The gynecologist recommended a hysterectomy, which was performed this April. It has dramatically reduced my pain. All of these procedures were performed under general anesthesia due to my movement disorder. It has always been difficult for me to undergo a pap smear due to my involuntary movements and difficulty maintaining balance on the exam table. Because I'm not sexually active, my doctors have only performed the procedure every 5 years. My health insurance initially denied my hysterectomy because they did not know that I had signed the consent form to surgery, and also because I had not had a pap smear in a few years, which is in line with practice guidelines. My mother, who used to work at the health plan, called the medical director and told them to waive the requirement for a pap smear to avoid unnecessary anesthesia. A pap smear was performed in the OR. A hysterectomy requires informed consent from the patient at the provider's office. I signed the consent form. However, the surgery was still denied by the health plan. This was because, as a disabled person, a secondary approval was required from the Department of Developmental Disabilities. This secondary approval is to safeguard women with intellectual disabilities from abuse. However, they did not take into account that I am my own guardian and I signed my own consent form. This required another phone call. No, because I had endometriosis, I had extreme pain. I am allergic to ibuprofen, and Tylenol does not help with the pain in my periods. I use low-dose hydrocodone, which is effective. My doctor doesn't have a problem prescribing it because of the relationship we've built. But when I call the clinic or the pharmacy for refills, they often assume I'm an addict. There is a misconception that all opioid users are addicts, and this creates a barrier for those who use the medication responsibly. Healthcare providers should be aware that opioids can be effective in controlling pain for some patients who use them responsibly. The United States Department of Justice cites the fear of opioid abuse can lead to discrimination against disabled people who experience pain. I experienced many obstacles to obtaining a hysterectomy. I hope in the future physicians will take individual experiences into account, which will lead to informed decision making on the part of patients. Are there any questions?
Well, Dr. Bushbera, we're gonna leave the questions for the end of the presentations. I encourage everyone to write them down. I know I'm going to point at the obvious, and is that we're not talking about a vasectomy, but the fact that Dr. Bushbara share her experience navigating the healthcare system for her reproductive needs is a reflection of what we were talking about with the context. And that's why we find it extremely important. We appreciate your participation, Dr. Bushbara. Please hang out with us so that we can wait until the session of questions. And to continue with our really packed session today, we're going to move on to our next speaker, who's Mrs. Erica Barron. She is, we're very grateful of your participation as well. She's an attorney. She practices at the Canadian law firm McCarthy Tatrell. She received her law degree from the University of Ottawa, and she will be presenting legal and ethical considerations for vasectomies for men with intellectual disabilities. We understand that there are jurisdictional differences in every country. And let me just tell you, take the opportunity to let you know that with a survey that we submitted before the webinar, we and I encourage you to continue to answer those questions of the survey that was sent, and Catherine can help us with putting a link in the chat box. We had initially people answering from 25 different countries. And so there are differences in every single one of these countries. You know, jurisdictionally, they have more protection, they have less protection, they have no protection of individuals with developmental disabilities, particularly when it comes with to sexual health and reproductive services. So obviously, understanding that there are differences, we're going to have Ms. Barron educate us a little bit on the general aspects of the legal implications on patients with disabilities. The forum is yours, Ms. Barron. We have you muted. There
Okay. Can you see my screen? I think is the more important question with my slides.
Yes, we can see it. We can see it.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect. That's fine. It's just not quite showing up the way I expected on my screen, so that's fine. So let me start by saying I also have no conflicts to declare, but I do have, just for everyone's context, I have a child who is developmentally delayed. He's 18 years old. This is a very interesting topic for me personally to think about and reflect on, and sort of think about the intersection between my understanding of the law and how the law works, and the sort of potential impacts on my son and our lives around this. So a few caveats. I am a lawyer who practices in Ontario. I am only qualified to practice in Ontario. I can only speak about the law in Ontario and Canada more generally. I do spend a lot of time practicing in the consent and capacity space, providing advice to doctors in considering consent and capacity issues in the context of all sorts of different medical treatments. But at least in Canada, the way what's called sterilization in the legislation, although I don't really love that terminology, but that's the terminology that's used, is treated differently than most other medical treatments in Canada. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So just, you know, we talked about this a little bit already, which is sort of the history, and Canada has a similarly dark history, and in fact, a much longer history than I was aware of before I started looking into this, and longer than even the United States, it appears. So, you know, and there's a picture, I've included a picture here from a Senate report on forced sterilizations, and you know, Canada has a long history. Starting in the 1920s and 30s, there were a couple of jurisdictions that authorized what would be considered forced sterilization, notwithstanding the consent regime that was included in them, because mostly related to people who were admitted to what were called mental institutions, although it was very common for people with intellectual disabilities to be admitted to mental institutions that was considered to be a mental disorder. And so those statutes contemplated forced sterilization for eugenics reasons, and but did have a quote unquote consent regime, but it contemplated consent by the person if capable, or by a spouse, parent, or guardian if the person was incapable, and if there was no such person, by a government authority. And so there's actually a case from 1996 that I've quoted here from Alberta, related to a woman who was sterilized, I believe with the consent of her parents. And the court awarded compensation against the government in due course, many years later, for that forced sterilization. And forced sterilization in Canada, I wish I could say had largely ceased. I think it has largely ceased. It's certainly, the legal ability for forced sterilization is very limited now, arising out of a case called Re-Eve, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. But the Supreme Court of Canada issued a caution about the approach to sterilization for a mentally incompetent person with the utmost caution, because the rationale that is typically provided in these circumstances involves values in an area where our social history clouds our vision and encourages many to perceive the mentally handicapped as somewhat less than human. And this, this case was a 1986 case, so very shortly after the passage of our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, that recognized as a protected group people with disabilities. And the Eve case involved a young woman who, you'll see sort of an interesting description of the rationale that was included here. And it says Eve was attracted. Eve was not the patient's real name. Obviously, this was a made up name. So Eve was attracted and attractive to men, and Mrs. Eve, namely her mother, feared that she might quite possibly and innocently become pregnant. Mrs. E was concerned about the emotional effect that a pregnancy and subsequent birth might have on her daughter. Eve, she felt, could not adequately cope with the duties of a mother, and the responsibility would fall on Mrs. E. This would understandably cause her great difficulty. She is a widow and was then approaching 60. That is why she decided Eve should be sterilized. And so that's the backdrop of this case, which is, I think, a perhaps well-meaning mother trying to do what she thought was best to protect her child. And that's the context in which the case was considered and determined and went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. The court quite rightly points out that surgery without consent, without any consent, is battery. And in the law of Canada, surgery without informed consent is considered negligence. And those are sort of different legal concepts, but both important ones to think about as physicians if you are reflecting on performing a procedure where either you don't have consent of the person or a substitute decision maker who's entitled to make that decision, or where you're not confident that the person who you have obtained the consent from is capable of understanding the information necessary to make a decision. And so the court spent a long time thinking about whether it had the ability in an appropriate case to authorize a sterilization, or I think in Eve's case, what was proposed was a hysterectomy, and concluded that the onus for demonstrating to the court that it was an appropriate circumstance would rest with the individual seeking it. And what they would have to demonstrate is that it would have a detrimental impact on Eve's physical or mental health. And so, and this is sort of the key passage that I've got on the right side of the screen, maybe not on your right side of the screen, but is sort of the rationale that is often put forward for sterilization for people with intellectual disabilities. This was a woman, but I think it is equally applicable for men, which is the fact that sterilization is not typically performed for the purpose of medical treatment. Now, that's not always the case, obviously. We just heard a story about why there was a medical reason for something that has the effect of sterilization. But I think, the focus is on the purpose of the procedure, right? Is the purpose of the procedure to sterilize the person, or is the purpose of the procedure to provide a medical treatment? And this becomes important when you look at the law of Ontario and Canada, because there is a distinction drawn between those two things. But I think that distinction is often easier to make. It's often more present in the circumstances of women, and perhaps is less present in the context of vasectomies, because there can be circumstances where it would be dangerous, for instance, for a woman to become pregnant, and so that might provide a justification for sterilization to avoid a pregnancy, or where it's being provided for menstruation management, which, you know, there's a debate about that. If it's to manage pain, that might be one thing. If it's to one of the rationales that is sometimes provided is it's not easy to manage menstruation for women with disabilities. And the question is, well, is that a good enough reason, or ought we just to provide more support for them? And so, you know, the court really struggled in the Eve case with the fact that there is rarely a medical rationale for sterilization where the goal is sterilization itself. And so, you know, they walk through the various rationale. And I put here a picture of a woman who herself has Down syndrome and chose to have a child who had Down syndrome. And there was a lot of publicity around it. She was very vocal about the fact that people were very judgmental of her decision to have a child, and about her ability to parent. And the court in the Supreme Court of the Eve case, I think maybe a little bit before its time in 1986, said, you know, this idea that people with intellectual disabilities, or even people who are incapable of making medical decisions, are not able to be good parents is a fallacy, and ought not to be one that we adopt writ large. That you really have to look at the circumstances of the case. And so the court rejected out of hand the idea that one should ever consider the interests of other persons in making a decision like this. So the fact that Eve's mother might have been left to care for a child if Eve became pregnant was not a relevant consideration for the court. And instead, you had to look to true health reasons for it. And most of them, the court says, are demonstrably weak, was the way the court described it. So, and so that's, you know, so at the end of the day, the court said, essentially, the court cannot make a substitute decision to consent to non-therapeutic sterilization. And I think the implication is neither can a substitute decision maker. So that's a court-appointed guardian, a power of attorney for personal care. That's simply not a decision that can be made because there is no health need for a non-therapeutic sterilization. So where does that take you? So, you know, important question. Is sterilization different from other treatments, other medical treatments? And the answer, at least in Ontario, is yes. And the reason for that is our Healthcare Consent Act in Ontario explicitly carves out sterilization from the consent regime that applies to almost every other healthcare treatment option in Canada. And this is true in almost every jurisdiction in Canada, and it's all a reaction to the decision from the Eve case. And so the Healthcare Consent Act uses this language and says, this act does not affect the law relating to giving or refusing consent on another person's behalf to any of the following procedures. And then one of the sections is sterilization that is not medically necessary for the protection of the person's health. Now, the language of this is important because what it means is that things that don't fit into this category are subject to the usual consent regime in Ontario. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, I think it means that this only applies to people where a decision would need to be made on the other person's behalf. And so what that means is that people who are capable of making their own decisions don't have decisions made on their behalf. And so this carve out that says you can't get substituted consent for sterilization, you must have a conclusion that the person is not able to make the decision for themselves. The second, what does it mean for something to be medically necessary or not medically necessary? And I think that will turn a lot on the facts of the case. And so the question is, okay, well, is it medically necessary to protect the person's health? And so these are all terms that are undefined in our statute, and it's not helpful that they're undefined, but there is theoretically a scenario where one might be able to come to the conclusion that the procedure that is being contemplated is necessary, is medically necessary for the protection of the person's health. And so I think either if the person's capable, then you go to the normal consent regime. If the person is incapable, you go to the normal consent regime so long as it is medically necessary for the protection of the person's health. That, I think, is going to be the harder burden to overcome. And so turning to what I say is questions and not a lot of answers, I'm afraid, because there's almost no law on this. Eve was sort of, essentially no one wants to touch this post Eve because it's so fraught with difficulties. But I would say this. In Canada, at least, the first question you must ask yourself as a physician who is considering whether to perform a vasectomy on someone who has a diagnosis of some intellectual disability is this person capable? That's got to be the first question you ask, because you ought not to be making assumptions that the person is not capable simply because they have a diagnosis of some sort. And the question of whether someone is capable in Ontario turns on whether they are able to understand the treatment and the reasonable foreseeable consequences of having the treatment or not having the treatment. There are lots of people with intellectual disabilities who could express a view that they would like to not have children, that it would not be in their interest to have children, that they understand that this will do this, that this is likely reversible or is likely difficult to reverse if they change their mind in the future. And so the first question you have to ask yourself is, well, is this person capable or not? If they are, then you can proceed with their consent. If they are not capable, that makes it a much more difficult decision. What about people with diminished capacity? So what do you do in those circumstances? So again, this is the same as with any other medical treatment. You have to consider, okay, I've got a person here and there are questions about their capacity. What am I going to do about that? And so the answer is document your capacity assessment. If you've come to the conclusion that they're capable, get some good documentation in the chart that they're capable and you've taken consent from that individual. Get a certified capacity assessment if that's what you need to do in order to get there, because one ought not to be depriving people of an option, a medical treatment option that's a reasonable one for them solely on the basis, well, you know, they've got this diagnosis and it's hard, so I'm just not gonna, it's too hard, so I'm gonna walk away from it. Now, the last category is where the person lacks capacity. And so in those circumstances, because of the operation of this provision, I think in Ontario, it likely is going to be very challenging to proceed with substituted consent. You certainly should seek legal advice if you've got that available to you. Certainly members of the CMPA in Canada, which is the Medical Protective Association, could get advice in these circumstances from the CMPA in all likelihood. But you'd have to probably demonstrate there was medical necessity and have a high degree of confidence that you meet that test. Are there specific legal standards or criteria that must be met to determine whether sterilization is in the best interest of an individual with an intellectual disability? So again, this is a complicated question. It will be very fact specific. It will probably require some pretty compelling evidence and probably quite challenging in the context of vasectomies for men. You'd probably want to get court authorization in Canada to be confident in a circumstance where you found that the person is incapable, but you think they otherwise meet the criteria. So what are the potential legal and ethical challenges that healthcare providers and families face when seeking sterilization procedures for individuals with intellectual disabilities? So I'm going to say something actually that I don't have on my slides. And the first one is a presumption that they're not entitled. Right? So like a sort of a baked in idea that someone who's got an intellectual disability must not be capable of making this decision. And I think that's the first thing to sort of let's check our biases. That just because someone has an intellectual disability, that doesn't mean they're not capable of understanding this particular decision and this particular treatment. But once you've come over that hurdle and concluded that the person is incapable, I think even Canada at least creates a very high bar to find that it is in the best interest of an incapable person to be deprived of an ability to procreate. That maybe is a little bit of an archaic idea in this day and age, that procreation is really important, and you know, but it certainly is something that people ought not to be deprived of without their consent. And I think it is a very risky thing to proceed with if the patient cannot express their own agreement. And so, you know, if there are conflicts and disputes, I think bioethics, legal advisors, probably isn't reasonable to proceed. Now, the one caveat that I would put on this is that whereas in Eve, what was being talked about was something that was entirely irreversible, which was a hysterectomy. As vasectomies become, as the ability to reverse vasectomies changes and improves over time, whether or not that's considered to be an intervention that is not in the person's best interest, if it could be reversed, and it's not a major surgery, the sort of threshold for it might change. So it's just an interesting thing to think about as the medicine evolves, how it's viewed from a best interest perspective might change. So recognizing that I'm a little bit past my time, I'm going to pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, I do have a bunch of resources on my slides, which can be shared afterwards if anyone wants to read about sort of the Canadian history around sterilization.
Well, these two presentations have a lot for us to unpack, because you both give us a personal perspective, give us also a legal perspective, and that's why, because of all the information that we received, that's why I wanted to make sure that we had the expectations adequately established at the beginning. You know, Mrs. Barron just told us that, you know, there are challenging answers here. We don't have a lot of answers when it comes to how we will approach the patient, you know, from an ethical perspective. I just want to say that, you know, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, Mrs. Barron, but we all know that not everything that is legal is necessarily ethical, right? And conversely. So the fact that there are laws, for example, quoting the examples that we have in the United States, the fact that there are laws, it doesn't mean that will protect us from doing a procedure, right? It doesn't necessarily mean we have to be light on making those decisions or on moving forward. The fact that we have an obligation to the patient, regardless of the underlying diagnosis of the patient, we have an obligation to protect the autonomy and the rights of the individual, has to be paramount in our relationship with them, has to be taken into consideration. Well, I want to again thank you, Mrs. Barron and Dr. Bush-Bara for the presentation. Just hang there for a second. We're going to have a couple of cases, and then we'll open the floor for any questions and discussions. I've seen a ton of questions already populating in the meeting chat. I appreciate that. We'll try to get to those questions, and but now we're going to move on to a couple of cases to get an idea of what the experiences have been for some of us. We're going to start with Dr. Stephen Shu. Stephen, thank you for being here today. He is a surgeon and a vasectomy surgeon specializing in surgical office procedures. He is the founder of the nonprofit Surgeon Volunteers that leads the Make Men Smile program that focuses on doing hydrocelectomies, repairing hydroceles for Haitian men who suffer from lymphatic filarial hydrocele. This is a beautiful, beautiful work that he's doing with patients in Haiti. Through that work, with that program, Make Men Smile, he helps men in Haiti regain their self-esteem, sexual lives, and labor ability. Dr. Shu, thank you very much once again for being here. And again, the floor is yours. Let's hear your case.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And is this shared? No, let me get this shared. Yeah, okay. Got it. Okay. Good morning, everyone. And actually, I just come back from Haiti, and we did about 40 for 40 patients, did 60 surgeries, and in the 3.5 days was very rewarding. And so let's present the case. This case was so about 3 weeks ago. I saw this patient mother is 70 years old and a Caucasian mother, and she's a guardian and brought the 26 years old, male adult son, and I call him MS. And he's intellectually disabled due to the hypoxia during the birth, and he is seeing a psychiatrist as a life guider, and but no really significant medical issues, mental issues, no depression or anxiety, or major kind of issues, not taking medication for that seems. But I don't have a full record from this doctor. And surgically, he had kind of left ectomy because a very small, seems unfunctional testis in the left side. So when he's very young, and removed, and have another hernia, deflected hernia repair. And he's not smoking, drinking, or using any drug. And he independently lives in the community apartment, like similar like a senior apartment in the U.S. It's just maybe some similar kind of situation like his intellectually disabled people. And he's working. He works as a table busser in a restaurant. His mommy told me he's sexually active. He agreed, and he had a girlfriend and used other birth control. And I did a physical exam to him, and he seems intellectually disabled and have a kind of decent communication and some, but not you can see some not a true totally normal. And general exam is unremarkable, and a male genetic exam and kind of a little bit smaller scrotum, and there no left testicle I can appreciate, and right side of the testicle is relatively small, but it's there. So mom is a 70 years old widow. I think she's very worried, and someday his son will have unintended pregnancy, and no one can take care of baby. He doesn't seem to have want to be a fit father or have a good care of kids, or she's getting so old, and then she don't know how long will live and all this. So mom is very worried, anxious. She printed a lot of the Vasectomy information from the website, and explained explained to his son, and so basically his son was coached pretty well, and it's reasonable understand the procedure, and so patient I specifically asked what he want. He did agree. Did say he agreed with his mom, and he should not have kids, and he cannot take care of kids. So I did suggest, may consider get a capacity assessment, but mom is really reluctant and not very interested. And I also suggested to do a semen analysis before vasectomy, since he has no left testicle, and the right testicle is kind of small, and the possibility maybe he doesn't have a spoon, have a small possibility. Not sure how. Just I think it's a simple test. Is if no spoon, really can avoid the vasectomy and will have a bigger benefit. But mom reluctantly agreed, say, okay, she will consider it, but haven't done yet. We called yesterday again to remind and see if they can do it. Then I also asked get a letter from his psychiatrist about his mental status and the treatment situation is more complete data. So, for I present this case here, and I'm a learner. I'm here not for the speaker, is just a presenter to this case, and I just show the way to vasectomy for him. And I'm not very clear about the laws on the vasectomy on this intellectually disabled in Florida or Minnesota. working few days each state. I have 2 offices, so I opened a office in the Florida. So I went close to the Dr. Dogstein. I always miss him. So this is my case present. So I like to hear everybody, especially the people have a more expertise, and I like to learn and see how to deal with this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for that presentation. That is what we're talking about. The real life cases that we are facing. Some of them, in a situation like this, as Dr. Shu was saying, we could get out of the whole discussion if the patient doesn't happen to have any sperm in a semen sample, and then we don't have to deal with that. But the point is not dealing with it. The point is, how do we face that situation? And that's what we're doing this. We're gonna address the question of, should we do a vasectomy for him? We're gonna open the floor for that discussion, and try to come up with an answer. Probably not a definitive answer, but considering what we have discussed already, to try to get the tools to address the situation better. There are a couple of points there from what you discussed, Dr. Shu, that raise questions, and we'll address that in a moment. Now we're going to move on to the next case.
Escar, you turned your speaker off.
Thank you for letting me know, Doc. You saw me just moving my mouth and saying nothing. Well, I'm going to be brief. I just wanted to thank Dr. Shu for the case. We'll keep it. I'll do a quick summary of the case when we start the discussion. We'll try to answer that question of whether or not he should do the vasectomy, but I don't know if that's going to be the right or wrong question, the right or wrong answer. But certainly we will give some consideration to certain aspects that need to be viewed when making this decision, or whether or not this happens. Let's move on to our very good friend, Dr. Douglas Stein, and the case that he has for us. As you know, Dr. Stein is a urologist and a full-time vasectomy surgeon for many years, and he's been a mentor to many of us in the vasectomy world. He's the president of the nonprofit Non-Scalpel Vasectomy International, and as many of you know, he is the co-founder of World Vasectomy Day. Doug, the audience is yours. You can go ahead and share the case with us.
Thank you, Escar. Let me go to, let me share my screen. Let me see. Okay, when I get out of World Vasectomy Day, there we go, share screen. And we'll go right to my presentation. Okay. Once again, big thanks to our donors. Let me present my case. It's about Ethan. He's 22. We got a call and a registration online from his mom. And my staff said, you should call this lady because she wants you to do a vasectomy on her son, who is intellectually disabled. And I got this history from his mother, that he went to a high school until 2019, not a conventional high school. But even after going to a high school for intellectually disabled, he needed some remedial education. So then he attended Goodwill Academy. Now, while he was there, he tried washing dishes at Subway, but that didn't work out. And finally, he, quote unquote, graduated from Goodwill in May of 23. He lived with his parents until June of 22, but he had problems with anger issues, and his parents had difficulty managing that. So they found a group home with a caretaker and 2 other young men about 30 minutes from their home, and they bring him home to visit every other weekend. Ethan doesn't drive, and working through the group home, an outfit called Ken's Crew is trying to prepare him and his colleagues for a job at Home Depot. Anyway, when he was at the academy, Ethan met Jennifer. Now she still attends the academy and lives with her parents. Ethan and Jennifer talk by phone. She is unable to FaceTime or even use a tablet. But he wants to visit Jennifer. And but his mother will not take him unless he has a vasectomy, because she's concerned that he may get Jennifer pregnant. Now, this is an extremely loving mother who has devoted a lot of her life to giving extra attention to her autistic son. And she just doesn't want to go through this again. And she knows that she would have as much love and devotion for a grandson as she did with her son, but she's not sure that she could handle that again. I did suggest that they do a home test kit, and apparently she was able to procure that. He was able to produce a specimen and it was positive for sperm. But I started to talk to her about sperm storage, and she looked into it, but said that she couldn't afford it. Now, I wanted her to present today, but she was unable to join the webinar because she had to work, and her husband was not feeling very well. So I sort of thought about this, and I never forget the movie I Am Sam, which is the story of an intellectually disabled man who does have a daughter and actually proves to be a capable parent. And I think that this has made pretty strong advocacy for the ability of at least some cognitively disabled people to be loving and supportive parents. But getting on with Ethan, I then spoke with Ethan, and he did confirm that he's afraid to drive. He said, yes, I have occasional outbursts, but because I just lose control, but physical restraint has never been actually required. He may want children in the future, perhaps when he's in his 30s. And he sort of suggests, I said, how would you support those children? And he's convinced that someday he could have a job at Home Depot, even though he couldn't maintain a job as a dishwasher at Subway. He knows about condoms and, promises he would use those. And he wants to visit Jennifer. But he says, my parents won't take me unless I can give them some assurance that I'm not going to get her pregnant. So then I spoke with the caretaker, Renee. Renee is as loving a person as the parents are. Again, she's responsible for Ethan and 2 other boys. She says she has a long experience with taking care of disabled persons, and she divides them into 2 types. She says, really, some almost have no thoughts of sex, and others want sex. And Ethan is the second category. She says he's smart, he understands a lot, but not what it takes to care for a child. And sometimes his expectations of himself are a little unrealistic because he never really commits to anything, but he does think he might be an NBA player someday. She has met Jennifer, who has a lower IQ than Ethan, and the agency would always respect the parental decisions. Again, in her experience, the girls often want sex more than boys, and she has known of cases where females would have their quote-unquote organs removed. She doesn't know why implants weren't used. And even during the course of this webinar, I'm not really sure, I guess. By the way, she was also unable to join this webinar because she had a busy weekend. And during the course of this presentation, I don't really know what forced sterilization means. Does that mean that you go up to someone like Jennifer and give her a sedative, an injection, and then take her to an operating room and that's the images that conjure up in me of forced sterilization. But if a vasectomy was provided for Ethan, would that be forced? Are they holding him hostage to not seeing Jennifer unless he gets a vasectomy? And is that more of a disruption of his private rights than his right to have a vasectomy. I'm still a little bit confused by the whole thing. This is just a little history that I did. I won't go through it all because Eskar covered this beautifully about the 60,000 Americans who might have been sterilized without consent. But there's really nothing out there. This was a great article, by the way, and this will be on the recording if you want to see it. But there really aren't any specific provisions. Some states have them, some states don't. They're generally the same for males and females. There's a wide range of intellectual disability. We have statements by the American College of OBGYN that having a mental disability does not preclude sterilization, and that basically physicians should consult family agents and caregivers, which I did. The American Academy of Pediatrics has put out a statement somewhat similar to this, but the American Urological Association has no published opinion. So their conclusion, as I reviewed this article for the case of Ethan, was that there's no dedicated consensus statement. State laws vary, but except for North Carolina, there's no real statement of prohibition. And I don't know, without informed consent, can Ethan provide informed consent? He seems to know what his tubes are. He read over our page about vasectomy. He reviewed it with his mother. He watched our counseling video, which diagrammatically shows the interruption of the vas tubes. So I think he has a pretty good idea. He has told his father on a number of occasions that he really doesn't want children, even though he left the door open to me that he might want children in his 30s. Although this, again, within the context of a difficult grasp of his own future reality, as maybe this idea of being an NBA player. And again, the conclusions are this should be a case-based approach, and maybe with medical ethics or legal counsel, but they themselves would have to make a decision. So we don't have any guidelines. So I'm going to turn this back to Eskar and maybe listen to your opinions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doc. Thank you, Stephen, Mrs. Barron, and Dr. Bushbara for your participation. Certainly, these are the questions that we're going to be facing, that some of us have faced at a certain point. I'm going to offer some thoughts about both cases, personal thoughts, and probably the thoughts that are the result of preparing this. And then I'm going to leave it up to our presenters to formulate their opinions regarding these two cases. So just to remind you, the first case was a 26-year-old with a history of an absent left testicle because it was removed before, was independent, sexually active, and for whom a request for a vasectomy was made. When the mother was asked to consider a capacity assessment, she refused. In that particular case, my answer, and that, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be the right answer, but my answer based on this is that that denial to the capacity assessment of the individual raises a red flag. And I wouldn't pursue that. I think it's more than reasonable to consider to obtain a sperm analysis, because this patient would actually avoid a surgery altogether if the sperm analysis is negative. But the reticence, just being a little not willing to get that either, also raises a red flag. It seems like this mother, and I'm not saying that she's coming from a wrong place. She's probably coming from a very loving and caring place in her heart. But she has a set idea of having her son having a vasectomy. Considering the fact that he is independent, that he has activities, he does not perform like other individuals. He needs adaptations for the fulfillment of his life. And he seems to have been able to fulfill his life. At the end, it has to come down, in my opinion, to whether or not he's willing to do it, and there's a demonstration of capacity. And let's just talk briefly about what capacity is, right? And Mrs. Barron was talking about this before. And capacity is that ability that the individual has to be informed about what is going to happen, and that individual is capable of saying it back, of expressing in his or her own words what is going to happen. Now, a piece here with the information given to the individual, and this touches upon what Doug was talking about with his case, is how the information is provided. Remember, I was talking about this social neurodiverse model and this medical model. If we approach these patients from the perspective of a social neurodiverse model, we would understand that these patients, for them to receive the information, they are not supposed to be getting the same information we give, or the way we provide information shouldn't be the same way we provide it to every single one of our other patients. There are individual needs in terms of how we provide that information. So in order to assess the capacity of these individuals to see if they can make that decision, even if they're not the legal person signing the consent at the end of the day, but just for the pure respect of their dignity as human beings, we need to make sure that we have provided that information in a way that is appropriate for the specific disability that the individual has. Some individuals have difficulties with speech. Some individuals have difficulties expressing themselves. Some individuals have difficulties reading. How do we approach that, right? A way I saw it preparing for this is that is as if I'm trying to speak with somebody who speaks a different language. I have to adjust to the language of that individual when I have them in the medical office, and not just provide the same information I give everyone else and expect them to understand it. And if they understand bits and pieces, they understood that bits and pieces. They didn't understand everything. And obviously, if the individual can appreciate the nature and the severity or the risks associated with the procedure, and we have provided them with the alternatives and can explain that back to us in a logical way, they have the right. I would say that they have the right to make that decision. In this instance, with that case, if the patient's guardian is refusing the capacity assessment, which would probably show that the individual might not be interested in doing it, I think that's a red flag. And with the other case, I commend all the details, Doug, that you gave with the 22-year-old who was basically, in summary, was a 22-year-old who was given a vasectomy as a condition for the enjoyment of his relationship. That's how I see it. And that on its own, it's a forced sterilization because it's coercion. That individual, to me, is being coerced. Now, he said he wants to have children. That has to be respected. Has he had a conversation with with his parents about not having children? Fine, but many non-developmentally disabled individuals have those opinions back and forth. And so there's, in that sense, I don't think there's any difference. The person at the, yeah, go ahead.
Could I just interrupt really quickly? I just wanted to apologize, but the translator has to leave. So I just thank the translator. I think she did an amazing job keeping up. Y bueno, ustedes que estaban escuchando en español, muy mil disculpas, pero la traductora tiene que irse. Y bueno, ya se acabó eso, pero la conversación va a seguir en inglés. So the conversation will continue in English, but the translator is leaving. Thank you, translator. Thank you for all the hard work. Okay. Puedes continuar.
So sorry, I don't want to extend myself too much because I'm not the expert here. I've just given my opinion from this. But just to round that up, the other thing that I noticed in your case, Doug, is that the person at the group home or at this group where these individuals go, to me, seems to be patronizing the behavior of individuals with developmental disabilities. And that's one of the problems with, that's one of the barriers with individuals with developmental disabilities when it comes to access of sexual and reproductive health, because people assume that they have a certain type of sexual behavior, And many times this is just the result of lack of adequate sexual education. You know, yesterday talking with a person from the ACLU, she was discussing the case of that she herself had with a patient whose mother wanted the patient to have an IUD, and the conversation demonstrated that the patient didn't know what that was, right? And the patient even didn't even have adequate knowledge of sexual intercourse. And when the mother was questioned about sexual education on an individual that was, I don't remember, I think it was in the late teens, early 20s, the mother said, and she demonstrated her own personal bias. She said, well, we're Catholic, we don't have sex until we get married. And what this individual did, the individual with developmental disabilities did, was next time she got her SSI checked, she went and bought a wedding dress. So that shows you that if there's no adequate sex education, well, what are going to be the expectations in terms of being able to assess whether or not they have a good grasp of what's happening at the time of a procedure like this one. All right, that's my more than 2 cents. My apologies for being extending me that long. But Mrs. Barron, Dr. Bushbara, what's your opinion on these two cases?
I'm happy to go first. I'm concerned about coercion for the second case as well. Because for consent to be informed, it has to be non-coercive. And I think it's very difficult to get past that. I also get that it ends up being coercive in the other direction, in the sense that if you did it, he'd get what he wanted, but if you don't do it, he doesn't get what he wants, which is to spend time with Jennifer. And it's a terrible conundrum for a physician to be placed in, because it's not like he's getting what he wants by you refusing it, but I think sometimes you have to accept that you're not responsible for the behavior of others as a physician, right? Is to perhaps express the view that that's not a reasonable condition, and maybe there's another way to explore meeting that. What I think is a reasonable need, and maybe even one that the patient does support, the idea that he doesn't want to get Jennifer pregnant, for instance, but he does want to see her, and so how, collaboratively try to figure out a solution for that problem, which is not an easy one. So but I'd be very concerned about coercion, especially when he expressed a view that he might want children, that he is capable of expressing a view, that is a high risk scenario for future lawsuit if the procedure were to go ahead. So that's the first one. The second one, the first one, I'm not so sure I think of I don't know whether it's a red flag to not want a capacity assessment, because it's so hard to know the reasons why people refuse capacity assessments. Sometimes it's just not being able to handle one more thing in their life, in the circumstances. So I'm not sure I see it as a red flag, but I think it's a problem, because I think you need the consent in that circumstances, or you need some sense of whether the person has capacity, although it's an open question as to whether they do or they don't. But I think it ends up being a bit of it would create a no-go situation in Ontario anyway, for proceeding in that circumstance. So it's not necessarily a bad reason why it's being refused, but I do think it ends up being an impediment. So I don't have much more to add beyond that.
Dr. Bushbara, do you have any comments on this?
She's not there.
We might have had her disconnected. Well, that's okay.
May I ask Eric a follow-up question?
Yes, go ahead.
Eric, I'd like to sort of be an advocate for the parents who really love their son dearly. They recognize the limitations of their son, that he's not necessarily able to enjoy many of the other things that we might enjoy in life. He doesn't even enjoy, he can't even enjoy driving because he can't handle that. He can't handle the joy of accomplishing an occupational endeavor. And they're of the opinion, I don't want him to not enjoy sex. I mean, sex is something that we all hold dear. And they almost looked upon vasectomy as an open door to the freedom to enjoy sex. And yet they, as his only guardians, just didn't want to take the chance that he would cause a pregnancy for which they feel responsible. The question that I would have for you, and one that I have considered myself, is you said that his one-time expression that he might want children in the future, and again, he has said on a number of other occasions that he wouldn't want children in the future, but then that may be conditional on him getting together with Jennifer. Is that assessment that he might want children any less, can we interpret that as a realistic, logical conclusion on his part, and put more stock in that than I want to be an NBA player or I want a vasectomy? And if there were some legal ramifications, how would that present? I could imagine that if I did his vasectomy, his parents would be happy and he'd be pretty happy. Where's the problem? Who's going to watchdog my private relations with my parent and maybe come and challenge me as an individual who, let's say, was a little premature in my provision of vasectomy for this young man, and unless he has, a magical godmother out there who had very, very different views and got word that he had gotten a vasectomy and felt that it was her godmotherly duty to initiate a legal action. I guess that would be my question. Where would this legal action come from?
Okay, lots to unpack there. So I'm gonna talk about this in the way that I would speak to a doctor if I were considering this issue in Ontario. So the first thing I'd encourage you to think about is who your relationship is with, because you said you mentioned a couple of times your relationship with the parents and being an advocate for the parents. And Eve is very clear, and the law is very clear, at least in Ontario, that your relationship and your obligations are only to your patient, and the parents are not your patient. This young man is your patient.
Mm-hmm.
And so the interests of the parents are irrelevant. Now, what they are expressing is partially their own interests, as you saw in Eve, and partially their views of what is in the best interests of their son. Namely, that he would get to enjoy sex without the burden of a child, or the risk of a burden of a child. But the idea that that you'd have regard for their interests, it cannot be a factor in the decision making around whether to offer a vasectomy to this young man. At least under Ontario law, you can only consider his interests. And so that's the sort of the first caution that I would sort of put forward for people to think about, is that what the parents want is irrelevant. Now, what do you do with his statement that may or may not be a capable statement? It's not it. My 14-year-old who's capable would also like to be an NBA player, but this is my neurotypical child. So it might also express that view. It might be an unrealistic view. It might be an incapable wish to be an NBA player, and it might be an incapable wish to be a parent, or to not be a parent. I think the problem is that any statements you are getting now are so wound up with the short-term desire to see Jennifer, which is being denied to him on the basis of him not having had a vasectomy. And so it's almost impossible to pull apart anything he says now because of that backdrop of coercion. So I think that's part of the challenge with this case is it's hard to unwind that. So then where would the legal risk come from? So you may be right. You may never get sued. And that is part of the risk assessment, but it's not actually the right way to say I won't get sued and therefore it's legal. That's of course not true. Lots of times people do things that are not legally permitted and there are no consequences to it, but that's neither here nor there. So maybe there isn't anyone who comes out of the woodwork, but if you look at the Muir case, and you said, well, you know, what's the vision of forced sterilization? Well, she was told that she was having an appendectomy and instead received a hysterectomy. That's what happened to her in that case. And I believe that case, she realized that she hadn't had an appendectomy when she and her husband were not able to get pregnant. And so that's where the risk comes. 20 years down the road, when this young man is in a relationship with Jennifer or somebody else, and they are trying to get pregnant and are unable to get pregnant, that's where the risk comes from, I think, down the road. And that's where I would foresee the potential risk is not the godmother who says, why did you do this to this person? But where there is actually a desire. And you can't predict whether this is going to be the case that ends there or not. So that's my perspective on that case and why it's so fraught with risk in the circumstances.
Thank you.
I also have a question. So if for capacity assessment, if the result come back, capacity assessment show patient can make own decision, but he already said to me, he agree with mom, don't want kids, and so there's no issue. Then if capacity assessment come back, say he cannot make an informed decision, and then listen to mom is guardian make a decision. For this point, does he need a court order? Say, you know, mommy, the guardian is not as a decision maker, not enough to make a decision for him because his intelligence is not enough to get a consent form. Should we get a court order? So this is my question is,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know in the jurisdiction that you're in. Obviously, I'm not qualified in that jurisdiction. In Ontario, not only would it be necessary to get a court order, what would happen in Ontario is that the patient would be assigned a legal guardian to represent their interests in front of the court, and so the court would first have to conclude that the person was incapable, and then have to assess whether it was in the person's best interest with the benefit of an advocate on their behalf. And that's one of those sort of protections that Eve said had to be in place if there was going to be consideration of this issue in the future, that, you know, all the parties would be in front of the court. Not dissimilar to the cases that you may be familiar with just because they're sort of in the media a fair bit, where there is a withdrawal of life support is being contemplated. So typically the person who has the patient plus whoever is proposing or not proposing to withdraw life support, all of those issues are mooted in front of the court. So that's how it would work in Canada. How it would work in your jurisdictions, I don't know. It would depend whether substituted consent is permitted for sterilization.
But mom did bring the court document for as she's appointed to be a legal guardian. She is a guardian. Then you need another third party for his protection.
In Canada, you would, because the law is that is not something that a guardian can consent to if it's a non-therapeutic sterilization.
Stephen, and I sent you internally a link to the report from the National Women's Law Center that has a summary with links to every single state in the United States and the laws on sterilization, on what can be done. Because my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert, but my understanding from the review here is that even though there are guardianships in different states, even if there is a guardian, in some occasions, the guardian has to go through the judge to make these decisions. In some other states, the guardian doesn't have to appear in front of a judge to do that because the guardianship has given them the authority to make these decisions already. So it's probably good to look at what happens specifically in Minnesota. Well, I mean, this patient is in Florida, but I was going to say, I know you practice in both Minnesota and Florida. So I sent you that. You might be able to see that.
Eric, another question is, how do you get a court order Is there a number that you can call? Who has to pay for that? Does the family have to hire a lawyer to serve as an intermediary between them and the court? And I suppose they can't afford a lawyer. It just may go on as an undone thing if you put too many roadblocks between the acquisition of the procedure, and they'll just give up. In Ontario, is that a free service provided by the government?
No, not unless, I mean, typically not unless you meet some criteria to have what's called legal aid, a legal aid appointed lawyer. The lawyer for the patient is usually provided pursuant to a legal aid certificate via the public guardian and trustee, who's sort of the government official entrusted with looking after the interests of vulnerable individuals in Ontario. But no, typically you don't have to have a lawyer. You can be self-represented in our courts, and but you'd have to bring, I think the person who is seeking it would have to bring the application. Theoretically, I suppose the doctor could, but I don't think that would be appropriate, where essentially you as the physician are saying, I can't take consent from this person who's asking it, but if there's a court order, I'm willing to perform the vasectomy in these circumstances. So I recognize that it is a big hurdle for families to get over if they want it, but that is on purpose, because it is the courts have made very clear in Ontario that non-therapeutic sterilization is a socially and significant thing, and that the courts will think long and hard before granting it. So it's not meant to be an easy process, for good reason.
Yeah, I think that in this case, they won't do it. I don't think they'll go through that process, and Ethan will remain celibate for many years as he is supervised by all caretakers, so that he is never alone enough to have conjugal relations with Jennifer.
I know we have extended ourselves way more than I personally thought we were going to extend ourselves. So part of it has been my fault, but the biggest chunk of the fault here is how interesting this topic was. I have lots of comments in the chat box. I feel terrible for not being able to review all those comments. Many of them are thanking the presenters, and many of those comments are offering opinions on this, on each one of these cases. I hate the idea of having to finish our conversation today, but the time has been extended a little too much already. So I want to probably try to summarize with 4 points what I think could be left for all of us. Certainly, as I said, in the expectations, establishing the expectations here, we don't have a template that we can apply to every single one of these cases. Every single case is different, but I think that these 4 points probably will be very helpful for us. I think that if we adopt a social neurodiverse perspective on approaching these patients, understanding that with adequate support when they're making the decisions, we will be able to provide a better service to these patients when we're considering a request for a permanent sterilization. Understand that neurodiverse, that social neurodiverse approach demands that we have adequate tools to educate these patients. And adequate tools mean we don't talk with them for 30 minutes, we don't talk for them for an hour. We might need to use with these patients 2, 3, 4 visits, and that requires a lot from us. But if we're willing to give proper services to these patients, we have to assume that. The second one will be that an informed consent is necessary, regardless of the guardianship that somebody may have over the patient. It is part of respecting the dignity of the individual to make sure that they understand what is about to happen, and do not presume that the individual with developmental disabilities is not entitled. Learn about the nature of the disability before approaching the patient. And finally, I would say that given the variations and the jurisdictions, each one of you has to make sure that you understand, you know the existing laws in your jurisdiction. The United States has 50 different states, and there are variations in all of those states. And in your individual circumstance, in your location, wherever you are, make sure that you understand what the law is. Remember that it doesn't necessarily mean that because there might be a guardian, it automatically you are legally allowed to do a procedure like this. You know, reproductive health is a very sensitive topic. And in some occasions, these patients, these guardians, these individuals would have to go through a court. Even though they are the guardians, they have to go through a court to be able to pursue something like this. So educate yourselves about the legal aspects in your own jurisdiction. Oh gosh, I feel terrible with all the messages that I'm seeing there. Forgive
It's fine.
me.
I'm
Forgive
actually
me.
trying to respond to some of the questions in the chat, so that's why you're seeing so many pop up. Is I've just been trying to
There you
answer
go.
some of the questions in the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful thing. I want to thank everyone, each and every one of you who participated, the presenters, the cases. This has been a wonderful experience for me preparing for this. I think that we can spend a whole entire day talking about this and many more cases, which it's impossible for us to do right now. But to the more than 150 participants that more than 140 participants that are still there, despite the fact that we're 50 minutes over. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for being here. I want to remind you of what Doug said at the beginning. Any of you who are willing to make a contribution to World Vasectomy Day, that contribution will be absolutely welcome. It could be $1, it could be 50 cents, or it could be $5 million if you happen to have them under your mattress and you don't know what to do with that. We can put those $5 million to good use and help promote the participation of men more actively in contraception around the world. Thank you so much for being here today, and stay tuned because great things are coming. Bolivia, November 2023, the great big celebration of World Vasectomy Day. Empowering men, empowering families in Bolivia is coming, and we're going to have the big summit at that time.
Escar, let's not forget to complete the evaluation form. It was a very, very exciting event today, and please complete the evaluation form. It helps us to get better the other time.
Yeah, and I
yes,
just wanted to
please do that.
Yeah, I wanted to thank everybody again. Thank you, Ms. Barron, for all your contributions, and Doug and Stephen and Escar for all the work you did to put this together, and all the people who put it together. Really amazing. These conversations, they're meant to be an hour and they go on. I think we're up to 2 hours and we're still, I think, 150 people. So, and also I think I'm told there are 150 students in the 7 universities been listening. So the information you share helps form the next generation of doctors in Africa, and it's really appreciated, all the shared wisdom and the thought that goes into this. And definitely, if you can donate, great. And this year, World Vasectomy Day is in Bolivia, but we're really supporting everybody everywhere that we can. So be part of it. You know, let it be known. We're going to reach out and share information, more details in the coming weeks. The next event is the summit, which is on November 11th. And it's a 2 or 3 hour event, so we get a chance to really go deeper into topics. Well, we have more topics to cover, really. So take care, everybody. Good luck, and thanks, everybody. Take care.
Jonathan Escar, thank you
so
very
much.
much. Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.